Welcome to the Thriving Children podcast, the show that helps parents and teachers to put the magic back in child development. Here's your host, Claire Crew.
This is episode 63 of the Thriving Children podcast. I'm Claire Crew, and in this episode, I'm super excited to be chatting with Bruce McLachlan about resilience, risk, and ridiculous rules. So a giant welcome to the show, Bruce.
Thank you very much.
So you're principal of Swanson School, which is in Auckland in New Zealand, and that site has also earned the title of the school with no rules.
Yes.
So I'd love to hear how you earned that title and what you're actually doing differently from your average school.
Well, it is a very much a media construct that we are the school without rules, because it sounds great, and obviously that's the way the media wanted to portray it. But the reality is we have the same sort of rules that most schools have in classrooms. But yes, there is certainly a lot of truth to the fact that there are no rules out in the playground, because what we have found is that we don't need them. We didn't set out to abolish all the rules overnight. We didn't make any announcements like that. We didn't say, from this point forth, you can do anything you like. Basically, what we did over a period of quite a long time was to turn our backs on behaviour that we had once prevented from happening. So if a kid was climbing a tree, we simply turned away. If children asked us if they were allowed to do something that traditionally we hadn't allowed them to do, we stopped saying no. And what we have now is a playground that is extremely free for kids. They can do virtually anything they like. In fact, I've never had a kid ask me if they could do something that they couldn't do. And in fact, they have on occasion asked me things which they haven't then gone on and done. One time, for instance, was a kid saying to me, "Can I ride my motorbike in the playground?" And I said, "Look, I'm not necessarily going to say yes or no, but I want you to have a think about how practical that might be." And I left it up to the kid. And he did not bring his motorbike in. So yes, we are the school with no rules in the playground.
Yes, good distinction. And definitely, I've been in the media too, and things definitely get warped to become way more extreme than they are. But for a lot of people listening in who are parents or educators or who are in leadership in a school setting, they would still see it as being quite extreme to not have those rules in the playground. By giving that ownership to children, there's concerns that there'd be all sorts of dangerous play, all sorts of bullying, all sorts of legalities. So what have you seen in those areas as a result of removing the rules in the yard?
Well, firstly, I think you're absolutely right. There are a lot of people who are incredulous, really. How can you take all the rules away? Surely children are going to get hurt. Well, actually, we don't have children hurt more than they would normally be hurt in any other playground which is full of rules. We probably have, in fact, less accidents, and one of the reasons for that is that children are more resilient physically. They're more capable physically. They push themselves, sure, but they do it within their own capabilities. So they push a little bit, and then they try that, and then they push a little bit more, and then they succeed and they push a little bit more. So basically we don't have any injuries that are significant enough for us to want to change the policy. We have less conflict in the playground, so we don't have fights in the playground at all. I was standing outside my office with a principal a few weeks ago who said, "Yes, but you must still have some fights." And I said, "Look, mate, I can't remember the last time I had to deal with a fight." And I've been in teaching for over 35 years, so that is very unusual. So less conflict, less injuries, less bullying. And that was something that we were a little intrigued about initially, because we didn't seem to there didn't seem to be a reason why that was the case. But in fact, over time, I think what we have observed is that our bullies are busy. And it makes you wonder whether, because we know who the bullies are, of course, and bullying doesn't stop necessarily because you have free play. What we have found is that it is significantly reduced because the bullies are busy. So all in all, what we have found has been extremely positive.
And certainly that really resonates with me and what I read in Peter Gray's book, Free to Learn. You know, he talks about when there's too many constraints, that's when we see all the antisocial behaviours come out, when in actual fact, in his mind, by giving children more freedom and more ownership of their lives and of their education, you would expect to see that reduction in bullying. So it's awesome to see that that's actually been your reality in that real life context as well.
We've actually stopped trusting children over the years. And this is something I've been saying quite a bit lately. When you trust children to not act perhaps like adults, because it's actually adults who are warlike and violent and nasty creatures. Kids, by and large, act responsibly and caringly. And I think we have, over a period of time where we've started wrapping them up in cotton wool, we have also started distrusting them. We make an assumption often that left to their own devices, children will hurt themselves, hurt others, or do something antisocial. And the reality that we've found is that that is actually not the case. Sure, leave a bunch of adults to your own devices, and that might be what happens, but it isn't what happens with kids.
And I think from that lack of trust comes that sense that, you know, at most sites when there is a lot of bullying and conflict and antisocial behaviour going on, I guess a bit of the academic push down as well, there ends up being less playtime because it's almost like that's going to be a positive solution, where in actual fact, you know, that's maybe not the right way to proceed.
I've certainly, since I've started being interviewed for this sort of thing and observed, people have come to visit and all that sort of stuff, I've been asked to speak places. I've obviously done more thinking about this and more reading about it. It wasn't something initially that I thought I was setting out to change the world or anything. It was just something that we did as part of a university study, in fact. They came into the school and said, would you like to be part of this study? And we're often a part of a university study. And this one was specifically about play, but not free play in particular. They asked us if we would like to take part in a study that looked at the possibility of reducing bullying and obesity in kids, which are problems that we all face these days. So we said yes. And the way we did it was to take away the rules around play rather than do what other members of the study did, which was to build fitness trails and add pieces of play equipment to their playgrounds. So we did things quite differently, but what we've found and what I've read and what I've considered since is that there are more and more schools contracting the time that children have for play. There was something I read the other day about English schools selling off playing fields to make some money, obviously, but also to cut down on the areas that kids were going to have to play in, and therefore be more constrained. And of course, if you spend less time allowing kids to play, again, you're constraining them. in a way because you think you need to. In fact, what we've done is we've expanded the amount of time that our kids play because of the positive benefits of that free play. So we used to have, for instance, something that a lot of schools do, which is to have an eating time. And so they sit down and eat before they go off and play. Sometimes there's a there's a reason for that, which is more to do with tidiness and litter than play itself. But there's also a sort of a responsibility that a lot of teachers have to monitor the kids' eating patterns and all those sorts of things. See if they're eating healthily and making sure that they're eating. I said to my teachers, look, we've been doing this free play for a while now. The kids want to play and they want more time to play. Rather than take class time away, let's actually take that eating time. I said, in my experience in New Zealand schools, kids don't tend to starve to death. They tend to eat whenever they're ready to eat. And sure enough, that's what they did. The litter situation stayed the same, but kids really appreciated having the extra time to play.
And so children eat when they come back into the classrooms, or they just eat at whatever point during that playtime that they feel hungry?
Well, it took a little while to persuade the teachers, but basically what I've said to the teachers and tried to reiterate on a number of occasions is let the kids eat whenever they want to eat, because the chances are they will eat when they're hungry and they won't when they're not. We've found that when kids have an opportunity to play, they play actively, for instance. They don't tend to sit and play on devices. That's something that, again, we weren't necessarily expecting, but it's been a very positive outcome. So we don't ban smart devices and things in the playground, and occasionally you'll see kids on a PlayStation or something, or a smartphone. But by and large, they choose to be active. Yes, they eat when they're hungry, and that's usually what adults do as well. And we don't see any problem with it. It was hard to get the teachers to change, and that was intriguing because the kids were easy to change, obviously, because they just were doing what they wanted to do. The parents were easy because they had kids coming home at the end of the day happy and tired, which is what all parents want their kids to be when they come home from school. But the teachers were here 24/7, and they wanted to control kids in the nicest possible way, which is what teachers tend to want to do. And they want to do it for the very best of reasons, but they can be very constraining when allowed to do that.
I think that for most of us who are teachers, we've been through mainstream education, and so we've got that history, and then we've been teaching for however many years, and that's the way it's always been done. So sometimes it can be hard to actually get that questioning hat on and go, well, actually, why are we doing it this way? And maybe there is another way that would actually meet our students' needs a little bit better.
I think there was a practical component to it as well, and that's not wanting to get the blame, because we live in a world where most education stories that are in the media are negative stories, and that's being part of this story of free play is one of the best experiences I've ever had in education, because it is universally such a positive story. But that is certainly not the case when you look at the media and you see what appears on TV news or the newspapers on a regular basis. The school stories tend to be negative. So it was nice not to have that sort of problem. But the teachers were the ones who were always thinking, I'm going to get in trouble if a child gets hurt, or I'm going to get the blame if a child doesn't eat healthily. So I kept saying to teachers, your job is not being a police officer, your job is being an educator. So by all means, educate kids, but our job is not to police what they're doing. And it took a while to change. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly can. So, Bruce, you delivered an amazing keynote presentation at this year's National Play and Playwork Conference, and that's actually how you came under my radar. And I guess in that talk, we had the benefit of seeing some video footage of how playtimes look and seeing some amazing photos. So, for those who are just listening in, maybe you can describe what someone would actually see if they arrived at your school when playtime was evolving.
Sure, it actually looks chaotic. It really does, and the reason it looks chaotic, I suppose, is because it is not what we have come to expect to see in a school. And now, when I go and visit other schools, I see a bunch of bored kids walking around with nothing to do. And and I'm not just the only one. When other members of my staff visit other schools, that's what they see as well, and they start realizing only then, really, what we actually have here. What it looks like is, as I said, chaos. There are bikes and scooters going in all directions, skateboards, ripsticks. Kids are throwing balls, kicking balls. There's running. When you go to the areas where certain activities occur, there are kids building huts. There are kids climbing trees. In the winter, we have a mudslide, which the kids have created themselves. So you'll see kids going down the mudslide. When that mudslide is hard soil in the summer months, you'll see kids going down that mudslide on bikes at enormous speed. You'll see them rolling truck tires down that mudslide slope, and you'll actually see them setting up ramps halfway down the slope so that the truck tire flies into the air, and then you'll see them lying underneath those ramps so that the truck tire goes up over them. And there are, on probably many occasions, most adults would look at it and be nervous about what a lot of the behaviour is that you see the kids doing. And I have come across as perhaps a little uncaring when I have said what I always say, which is, if you don't like it, look away. Because the reality is what behaviour is happening in front of you would still happen whether or not you were there. If you can't be there through the all of the times that a child may possibly be climbing that tree. So there's a lot of times when you're going to be not seeing kids doing things that make you nervous. So I say, if you don't like the look of it or you're worried about it, turn away. We have an old shipping container that I've brought in that we have seeded with a whole bunch of tools and junk, basically, and we call it our tinkering shed. And kids take apart computers and lawnmowers and washing machines and things and see how they work and have fun doing that sort of thing that probably used to be done more in Granddad's garage back in the old days than we probably do these days. So it's a very busy playground. The kids are very active, as I said before, and it does look an environment where children may get hurt. But as soon as you get into it, you'll have kids coming up to you. They're very polite. They're very interested in why you might be there visiting. So they'll be, asking you questions. It's a delightful playground. It has a feel to it that is quite magic.
Yeah, and quite unique too, certainly at this point in time anyway. So Bruce, yard duty would look really different at your school because there wouldn't be the normal patrolling, there wouldn't be those ridiculous rules that we have to enforce. So what is the role of the teacher at playtimes?
We have our teachers now who say that doing duty is a pleasure rather than a chore, because what they have to do basically is just wander around chatting to kids. They no longer sort stuff out. There's no longer a queue of kids coming up to them saying, so-and-so's doing this, and, so-and-so's being mean to me. So they have less to do in terms of policing and more to do in terms of just passing the time of day with kids and taking part in their play. Today I was out there and there was a gymnastic school that was happening, and one of the girls came up to me and said, Mr. Mac, those people there are in the waiting room and those people there are in the gym, and we bring them through, and that person over there is the teacher, and you become involved in their games, which is quite delightful. So yard duty is definitely not what it used to be. For a start, we used to have probably a dozen teachers on duty. It's a big school, 550 kids from 5 to 13. So we used to have a dozen teachers odd on duty, and now we have 2. And we used to have timeout rooms where, if kids lost their temper or got into trouble, they would spend time in timeout. We don't have a timeout room anymore. So it is totally different in terms of doing duty to the way it used to be.
I'm sure that would make a lot of educators very happy. Yard duty is not normally high on the list of things that you enjoy within your working day, that's for sure.
Right. And
so so you go.
Yeah, no, and it is something that has become something that the school wishes to very much so to keep. I handed in my notice a few months ago, and I'm actually leaving in a few weeks' time. And the Board of Trustees, who employs me on behalf of the Ministry of Education, has made it very clear to the next principal that free play must stay. And not long after I gave my notice, there was a whole bunch of conversations happening in the staff room, in the community, among the children, about whether we would be continuing free play under this new principle. And that is very encouraging. Our whole community, children included, are totally committed to this and don't want to see it change. So it's certainly made an amazing change here.
It's brilliant that you've left that legacy, essentially. The community's taken ownership of it now. And that's a really important question to touch on, probably. So it seems like parents are really on board because they can see the proof's in the pudding. But was there some resistance in the early days about these changes that were happening? And what did it take to bring them on board?
There was actually no resistance at all, virtually, from the parents' perspective. And a number of people have asked me over the years, how did you ask permission, or how did you make those changes with the parents? And in fact, I didn't ask. I jokingly say to people that I prefer to ask for forgiveness than permission. But there's a certain amount of truth to that as well, because we're very risk averse in society these days. And parents are very, very concerned that any changes that might affect their children physically or add to the possibility that an accident may happen is very naturally something that they're concerned about. So it was a purposeful thing that I did, but I basically started taking away the rules gradually so that everything didn't happen at once. I didn't announce overnight that from this point forth there were no rules, but we started turning a blind eye, and we started letting kids do the sorts of things they had traditionally not been allowed to do. Within a very short period of time, kids were saying to mum or dad at home, Mr. Mac says it's okay if I ride my scooter in the playground, or I ride my bike in the playground, or I ride my ripstick or my skateboard. And parents were starting to drop these things off on the kiss and drop outside the school in the mornings and pick them up in the afternoons. Nothing was being said. It was just organic. It just grew. Kids would come home and say, I'm building a hut and it's got 3 floors and I'm using this piece of wood, and the kids would have all these stories, and all the parents were hearing were the positive, happy stuff that they were coming home with. So when we started getting publicity about it, which was 2 or 3 years after we'd actually started, really, by then the parents took the whole thing on board as just what was natural and normal at Swanson School. And if anything, they were even prouder because their school was featuring as an example for others.
That's amazing. And that's, I guess that's a bit of encouragement for other schools out there that, want to dabble in something like this, but feel that the big resistance will be from the parent community, perhaps,
Yes,
but
yes.
perhaps not as well.
Yeah, I've had literally hundreds, in some cases, certainly when you're talking about people overseas, contacting and attending conferences and things that I've spoken at. Thousands of people have started to consider whether in fact they could change what they are doing in order to be able to get what we've got. People overseas, from not in New Zealand, have different legal systems. We have a very well organised state insurance scheme called ACC, which stands for Accident Commission or something. Yeah. And they basically allow sports injuries, injuries in schools, injuries in your workplace and all the rest of it to be covered by a sort of a national tax. So we take that for granted, but that enables us to do things that potentially might result in somebody getting hurt with there being no cost involved in it. Overseas, you've sometimes got to retrieve your medical costs by suing somebody, and we don't have that kind of environment. So a lot of people have expressed interest and have wanted to make changes, but have felt there were constraints that perhaps prevented that. But I've also been contacted by a lot of people who have told me that they have at least freed up some of the sillier rules in school playgrounds, and that's very positive.
Definitely. And a good distinction to make still. Obviously, like I know some listeners of the podcast are in America, and I'm guessing that would be a very different climate over there, but still worthy of investigating. And as you say, just rethinking those ridiculous rules a little bit more, because it may not end up looking like Swanson School, but there's still a lot of middle ground where we could give children a much more positive experience within their learning day.
Absolutely. There's lots of aspects to free play and what we do at Swanson, and I've spoken at a few conferences. You mentioned the Playworkers Conference just recently, and a short while before that, I had spoken at a Nature Play Conference on the Gold Coast, and the focus in particular at that conference, obviously, was nature play. When kids have the opportunity, we've found, to play, they will often be active and they will often be outside. They don't choose to be inside and sedentary, and that's intriguing. We wouldn't necessarily have expected that to be the case. We sort of think of our society these days as quite sedentary. Kids aren't naturally sedentary. Given the opportunity, they are active. So
they're listening to that inner drive.
Yeah.
And that's something that I'd love to touch on. So classroom learning at your school, you already pointed to it before. It does have rules, and it is, probably almost identical to how things are done inside the classrooms at schools in the next suburb over. So have you seen any positive spillover effect of this different look at playtimes into what goes on within the four walls of the classroom with behaviour or with learning?
Very definitely. One of the things that was obvious right from the very beginning was the petty he did, she did type of arguments that teachers have to deal with in the first 5 or 10 minutes of every teaching session after a break ended. That there wasn't that, because the kids had the opportunity to sort those things out. So that was one of the first things that we noticed. Then we noticed that kids were more settled in the classroom, and in particular, the kids who were more settled were the kids who, usually boys, who were normally very active in their classrooms, so getting up out of their seats or fidgeting or this sort of thing, walking around or poking people or doing what naughty little boys have been doing for centuries, probably. What we've found is that the normal way a kid switches on their brains is to fidget if they haven't had an opportunity to be active. But of course, because our kids have had that opportunity to be active, they don't need to switch on their brains, so their brains are all ready to go. So teachers have found that kids are much more ready to learn. We haven't been able to sort of put statistics to that, and that's been one of the nice things about being in a school rather than in a university. We don't have to, produce statistics. We actually say, well, this feels good, so we just carry on doing it. But we have certainly noticed the positives in the classroom. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So for other schools out there, Bruce, who are keen to follow your path, do you have a beginning step that they could take?
Yeah, I would. I've said this to many, many people. I've said to try very hard to talk about it and think about it beforehand so that you're all sort of committed to it. When I say all of you, I mean talking about the teaching staff mainly. And there are lots of schools who've come in to observe what we do or talk to me, who've also included some influential members of the parent community as well. But basically, you talk about it beforehand and you value it and you read about it and you watch some videos. And then basically stop saying no. And stopping saying no doesn't sound like a very difficult thing to do, but turning a blind eye and stopping saying no, particularly when you're talking about children who might get hurt, is a very hard thing to do. And that is certainly what I would be advising people to do, because it is the way we did it, and it is organic. It grows gradually. It's not something that results in total chaos overnight. I remember back to a time back in around about 2011 where, in fact, we did do that to a certain extent. We were having a number of kids. We'd started free play quite a while, way before that, and kids were doing lots of things like climbing trees and building huts out of junk and that sort of thing, because we'd started putting junk in the playground for the kids to play with, and they'd loved it. And a few kids started riding their scooters that they had ridden to school but had normally been told to, park them and leave them till the end of the day. They started riding their scooters, and a few of the staff said, why don't we make an announcement to say that the kids could ride their scooters? And I didn't think it was a problem at that stage, so I said, yeah, well, okay, let's do that. I was actually quite pleased that the teachers had thought of making that kind of an announcement, because it seemed as if that was them coming on board. So I was quite pleased that was the case. So we made an announcement that the kids could actually bring scooters the next day, and the next day, 400 people turned up with scooters and wanted to scoot everywhere, and we ended up having to deal with a bit of chaos. On a normal day, and we actually have a break time at the moment, and I'm looking out over the playground, I can count half a dozen kids on scooters, not 400. But of course, the announcement was the reason why we ended up with 400 all at once. So the turning a blind eye, the stopping saying no, is a way of making things happen organically or gradually. Another thing that I've talked to a lot of people about, and this is happening in various parts all over the world, is allowing kids to play with junk. We initially got introduced the idea to us, and it was called a loose parts pit. So basically, it was a bunch of junk in a fairly constrained area, and we had an area that used to have a playground in it, and it was just simply within a retaining wall with some bark mulch in it. And we actually one day just threw in a whole bunch of junk. There was pipes, offcuts, wood. There was an old fire hose, and the kids just loved it, absolutely loved it. So we have told other people about that, and that's now morphed into the whole school being a loose parts pit. Basically, there's sort of junk everywhere, and that's something that has been taken up overseas. For instance, there's things like play pods where you can hire a container load of junk, and they come into your school, and you just open the doors and let the kids at it. And of course, playgrounds that have been world famous, like the Land in England,
yes,
which are places where junk is basically what the play equipment is, are extremely popular with the kids. So stop saying no, turn a blind eye, and give them lots of junk to play with.
Yeah, and that last point I think is key, because even just by not saying no, normally playgrounds are quite sort of limited and restrictive in how they're set up. There's different zones for different age kids that they have to stick to. There's a lot of the pre-made play equipment, but it makes sense to me that you actually need to bring in some other resources to, I guess, encourage that exploration and that play in other ways as well.
Yeah, school playgrounds, the plastic fantastics that I term them, look lovely often, and they're usually developed by adults, often taking into account kids' capabilities and that sort of thing, sure. But my wife and I were out walking a few weeks ago, and we came across this playground and at this beach, and she said, "Oh, what a neat playground! It looks like a pirate ship." And there were areas that they could play in and get in and out and all the rest of it, and not a kid was on it. And it says a lot about plastic fantastics, because we actually have a plastic fantastic in our school, our playground, proper playground. And yes, there are kids playing on it, but basically once you've played on it and you've done that 2 or 3 times, it's boring, and you've actually got to find something else to do. A piece of wood can be whatever your imagination wants it to be, and on different days is different things. And several pieces of wood put together in a certain way is lots more fun than stuff that you are playing on that doesn't change its shape or whatever. We've had kids, for instance, who have made their own seesaw. I'm not sure whether you Aussies call them seesaws, or I think the Americans call them
seesaws. I'm originally from England. I call them seesaws. I don't know what other names they might have.
Well, when you make your own seesaw, you play with it for a while, and then you repurpose the wood to be something else. So when you've got a rope or something, then you build or construct somehow a swing in a tree. You play with it for a while, and then you take the rope out and it's repurposed in another way. So junk is amazingly flexible as far as kids are concerned. And they'll play with the same piece of wood, but it will mean different things to whoever is playing with it.
And always developmentally appropriate as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So sadly, Bruce, we're out of time. I've loved chatting with you. I've had a big smile on my face the whole time that you've been talking. And I think that your voice and I guess your school as a case study is very much needed in the circles of education and play right now. So please don't just go and vanish into retirement, will you?
No, people can still contact me. And that's, I'm very happy to talk about this. And the school website has videos of what we do that have been made by people. So by all means, have a look at what we do and do it yourself.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'll put a link to all of those things in the show notes, as well as that. Was it on SBS, the documentary about the school with no rules?
Yeah, that was the best documentary that we've done in the school. Dani Isdale did a fantastic job there with that. So, yeah, that's a great documentary there.
Well worth watching. And I think it layers onto this podcast beautifully, because then you can see a bit more of it in action as well.
Sure, yep.
So thanks again, Bruce. Love what you're doing, and thank you so much for sharing it with us all today.
Thank you.
So that's the end of episode 63. Until next time, be kind to yourself and start rethinking recess.
Thanks for listening to the Thriving Children podcast. For even more goodness, visit www.thriveeducationandwellness.com.au.